welcome you to our webinar, Understanding the Impacts of COVID-19 on Chicagoland Communities, Forecasting the Future of Tax Policy, Revenues, and Municipal Government. Our event this morning is the result of a special partnership between the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and the Department of Public Administration at UIC. A few housekeeping notes here. The webinar is being recorded, and the webinar will be shared through email after the presentation is over, and it will be posted on our website. And if you have any questions as we are going through our presentations and discussions, please submit the questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and we will try to get them in during our session. COVID-19 has been a traumatic and revealing experience for everyone, but in drastically different ways from one community to another, from one state to another, and across our region. Tax policy and the financial situation governments face will determine how we recover from the pandemic. This event features 3 experts in municipal finance and governance, examining both near-term and longer-term consequences of the ongoing pandemic. And we will look to see what shifts are needed locally, regionally, and statewide in order to build and sustain more resilience and equitable communities. Today's panelists are local to our area and all are friends of mine, and I am so excited for them to be here. Our first speaker is Dr. Paula Worthington. Paula is a senior lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy, where she serves as an academic director of the school's Policy Labs program and faculty lead of its Master of Public Policy program. She advises the Council of Economic Advisors in Washington, D.C., the state of Illinois, and our region on financial issues facing our governments. And in particular, she advises MPC on a lot of its financial management issues as well. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Pagano. He is the Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC, as well as the Director of UIC's Government Finance Research Center. He is a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program and co-author of the National League of Cities City Fiscal Conditions Report, which was just released. And we are happy to have him here. He also guides MPC in rethinking its strategy for more effective government. Our final speaker is Chris Morrill. Chris is the Executive Director of the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada, which is a 21,000 member professional association of government finance officers that seek to advance excellence in government finance to build thriving communities. Prior to his current role, he has served in several government roles as the City Manager of Roanoke, Virginia, Assistant City Manager and Budget Director of Savannah, Georgia, among others. And he brings a practical and solutions-oriented approach to public finance, and we are happy to have all 3 here. I would ask Paula if you could unmute your audio and video, and we will get started with you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to Adam and his colleagues at MPC for arranging this webinar and for inviting me to participate. I have prepared a few remarks, so I'm going to go ahead and launch into them, and then my colleagues, Mike and Chris, will do the same. So just give me a moment to set that up.
Perfect. Okay.
Many screens, but only one person to manage them. So that's where we are. Let me just offer the overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I have 4 things I want to sort of touch on. One is to put a dollar amount on what we expect the impact to be on states and to some extent local governments fiscally from the pandemic and associated economic disruptions. Second thing will be to talk a little bit about why Illinois is particularly vulnerable. And then the third thing will be to sort of talk about federal support as it's already been offered up and used, and talk a little bit about how Illinois has made some choices to date on how to manage its affairs. And then finally, talk very briefly about some policy options that people can consider. So here's one of many pictures one could point to. This is from the second quarter GDP release from a few weeks ago. This is an early glimpse of the second quarter impacts of the pandemic and shutdowns on tax receipts of state and local governments. You can see that sales tax receipts fell quite dramatically, 12.2%, and that's not at an annual rate. So, you know, really quite a remarkable decline. So it's pretty serious. This is another expression of that serious impact here. This is based on monthly data, not seasonally adjusted, from the Illinois Department of Revenue. And I would highlight, of course, the green line here showing you for fiscal year 2020, what's been happening here to sales tax collections in Illinois. Obviously, a real collapse through April and May, and even into June, some rebound in July, which isn't shown here, but pretty dramatic impacts. How bad are things going to get? Well, there's some evidence based on national data that looks at the historical relationship between economic activity as measured by the unemployment rate and state government tax revenues. And essentially what that evidence suggests is that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, you're going to see a $40 billion decline in state tax revenues. That's at an annual rate. Couple of ideas there: that holds the tax policy choices of state governments fixed, and it does not include spending impacts. For example, the need to spend more money on Medicaid, for example, and it doesn't include local government tax revenues either. So that's a pretty big sort of impact, right? As unemployment rates creep up, we would expect to see, based on historical evidence, significant declines in state tax revenues. So what's going to happen to the unemployment rate? Well, of course, that's a forecasting game. I'll just share one particular forecast. It's, of course, not the only one out there. In the fourth quarter of last year, the unemployment rate averaged 3.5%. Can't emphasize enough that we were in the labor market of a generation. Low unemployment rates, some evidence that wages were rising, increased labor force participation, just really quite amazing. By 2020, the fourth quarter of this year, CBO is projecting a 10.5% average unemployment rate, with some improvement through 2021. So what does all this take us to? Well, it basically takes us to a place where the estimated state budget gaps that are likely to emerge over the 3 fiscal year period are on the order of $500 billion. And people have different views on the timing of that. And there's some, lively professional discussion about some of the dollar amounts, but in big picture terms, that's the space we're in. So you can see that, for example, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities shows the greatest impact in fiscal year 2021, but a continued impact through 2022. So it's a pretty serious impact on our states. How about Illinois? Well, Illinois too is going to feel the brunt, and already has felt it. My own work echoes the findings of the national study I referenced earlier, and by my estimates, every 1 percentage point increase in our state's unemployment rate decreases state tax revenues by an estimated $870 million. So as of 3-4 months ago, that put me in the space of around $3.5 to almost $9 billion impact on Illinois on an annual basis. And that's a lot of money, given that we're talking about annual tax revenues for the state of around $40 billion. So it's going to be a big deal here in Illinois. Why do we care about Illinois? Well, we care a lot because we're already very vulnerable. And I just have 3 slides to make that point, 3 or 4 maybe. First of all, we've spent more than we've collected in revenues systematically over a long period of time. These figures from the Pew Center show us that Illinois, over a 15-year period of time, basically collected less than 95% in revenues relative to its spending over that time period. And for the median state, it was about, they collected a little 2.6% more than they spent. So Illinois has consistently spent more than it has collected. We don't have any rainy day funds. These 2 charts kind of make the story pretty clear. Illinois is at the bottom of the heap in terms of how many dollars we've set aside for bad situations. And that's the graph on the left. And then, of course, the graph on the right is showing what happened overall across the country for other states. And what you see is that after the Great Recession, states really did get their acts together and begin to accumulate reserves. So that's really a nice story overall. By the end of fiscal year 2019, they were looking at about $75 billion in reserves across all the states. But Illinois basically had nothing. Another way that states save for a rainy day is by putting funds and accumulating reserves in their unemployment insurance trust funds. But again, Illinois, not the case. This is one particular representation of that, looking at essentially how much they have saved up relative to how much they would be expected to have to pay out in a bad recession. So you're looking for numbers that exceed 1. You want to actually have enough reserves in order to meet your obligations in a bad recession. So Illinois was sitting at 42% of the funds needed. And again, the median state was at about 109%. Again, not so good for us. And then, of course, I'm sort of spoiled for choice on this particular issue, but we all know Illinois has a pretty significant problem in terms of unfunded pension liabilities and or underfunded other post-employment benefits like healthcare benefits promised to our employees. So this is just one representation of the problem, showing that Illinois here in the lower right has a very high unfunded liability relative to state GDP. And it also has a low funding ratio. So we're really behind the 8 ball on that. Okay, so we've got a number, $500 billion, $5 to $10 billion of which is an Illinois impact. We see why Illinois is particularly vulnerable. Now let's just talk briefly about what the federal government has already done to assist states and localities. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act was one early piece of legislation, increased the federal medical assistance percentage by 6.2 percentage points. That's how the federal government helps states pay for Medicaid. That's got an estimated impact of about $40 to $50 billion overall for the whole country, with about 1.1 to 1.2 billion of that likely to go to Illinois. So that's significant. The CARES Act had many different provisions. Just a couple to mention here. We got some specific money for things like transit. We got some specific money for pandemic-related expenditures. And that specific money was allowed to then be reallocated downstream. Some of it went to the state, some of it went to larger local governments. So it's been spread out, but just to emphasize, those dollars have to be spent on admissible types of expenditures. They can't be used to plug budget gaps. All right. So what else? Federal Reserve Municipal Lending Facility. The Fed agrees to purchase up to $500 billion of municipal debt. That's a big deal. And of course, there's always long-standing been the federal government willingness to lend money to states to keep their unemployment insurance trust funds solvent. And so that's available to states as well. So what has Illinois done? As of a few days ago, we are one of 12 states to have borrowed to put money in our UI trust funds. Relatively cheap money, so that's probably a good call to make that commitment. We're also the only state so far to have borrowed from the Fed's municipal lending facility. We borrowed $1.2 billion. The state has authorized up to $5 billion. Again, pretty cheap money, but say more about that in a moment. We're letting our unpaid bills creep up, okay? That could be expensive if we let that happen persistently and let that backlog grow. So we pay pretty high interest rates on that. And speaking of borrowing money, important to keep in mind that the state's vulnerable financial circumstances have been rewarded in the capital markets with deteriorating ratings. The state of Illinois is now rated just above junk status. And that has pretty significant implications for the rates of interest facing the state on the markets right now, as well as should we fall below junk status, fall into junk status, fall below that threshold, some of the rates of interest we're paying will have to go up. So that's a pretty big deal. So what can the federal government do? A couple of ideas. They're not new ideas, but I think they're particularly compelling right now. First thing is the federal government needs to provide large and flexible fiscal support to states. It can't have to be thrown into a tizzy, a legislative frenzy every time there's a problem. So there has to be some automatic nature here. You could link fiscal aid to monthly unemployment rates or other measures of need. You also want to consider capacity, what states have available to themselves in terms of tax bases. So there's a lot of work out there on general fiscal grants, Medicaid, schools, all things that states spend a lot of money on. Second thing, federal government should make a commitment to investing in infrastructure. This has a lot of pluses. There's an immediate fiscal boost and multiplier effect, good impact on jobs, but also raises productivity and potentially can advance your equity goals. One big issue to keep in mind, you don't want to reward irresponsible states. How do we address the moral hazard problem? There's going to have to be some strings attached to some of this federal assistance. For state and local governments, they too should be thinking about infrastructure investments, and this is aligned with certainly work that I know has been important for a lot of the people in this session, a lot of people at MPC and elsewhere. We want infrastructures that rebuild better. We want to address underinvestment, disadvantaged communities. We want to improve inclusivity, sustainability, equity, and things like that. So for example, when we think about City of Chicago and lead service line replacements, we know that's in the news right now. How are we going to pay for that? But we need to do it. And maybe this is the time to make that a priority and get it done. Think about transit. Maybe we need to reframe how we're thinking about transit in our big cities. It's an essential service. Maybe it should be funded out of general revenues with less emphasis on operating revenues. Also think about allocations that are intended to be aligned with capacity and needs instead of just being driven by population or some sort of political calculus that says every jurisdiction must get some minimum amount of money from a given pot. So I think I've tried to sort of lay out, some of the big picture things. I'm looking forward to what Mike and Chris have to say, and Adam leading us in a further discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Dr. Pagano, if you could unmute your microphone and share your screen, we would be appreciative.
There we go. Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you, Paula, for that presentation on what we might be thinking about at both the federal and state level. My presentation will focus primarily on at the national municipal level. I think this pandemic has created an opportunity to really for us to rethink in a big way the way in which we generate resources to provide public services in our cities, in our counties, and in the state. But most of my presentation will be about municipalities. So the steps that I will be walking through in these next graphics will include some work that I have been involved in with the National League of Cities for 30 years, which is primarily monitoring the general fund revenues of municipalities across the country, not just the largest ones or the smallest ones, but a sample of all municipalities, examining their city reserves, their policies over time. Some estimates of what the pandemic is, the effect the pandemic is having on cities, and why we're not quite feeling it across the country in entirely the same way, and some sense of then the variation of municipal revenue structures across the country, and then finally just a call, a plea. I think this is the time is right. So this is since 1986, data have been collected on the general fund to demonstrate how the year-to-year changes in general fund revenues and general fund expenditures have played out over the course of the last 30-some-odd years. And you'll notice in this area here where there's been growth from 2013 to 16, this was the recovery period for municipalities. And you can see that there was a long decline from 2007-8 into negative territory for about a 5 or 6 year period. Year-over-year changes were actually negative rather than positive over a smaller base. And so by the time we get to 2014 or so, we're beginning to see a positive increase in general fund revenues, and spending kept up with it. This last year, 2020, you can see it's sort of all over the place. So these, it appears that revenues are going to plummet, possibly, and expenditures are going to increase. Then I just want to make a note that this is unlike the Census Bureau. When the Census Bureau does its 5-year government finance report, it standardizes the fiscal year so that you're reading data from a particular year. We allow, in the collection of data for the General Fund Revenue Project, we allow cities to define their own fiscal years. We don't adjust for the fiscal year. So what we're seeing is that at the time we collected this data, which was May and June, just past May and June, about somewhere near half of our municipalities were coming toward the end of their fiscal year, which ended in June 30, but there were a lot of municipalities whose fiscal year ends December 31st. So they are the ones who are going through a process of rebudgeting for their fiscal 2020 budget, as opposed to cities that whose fiscal year ends on June 30th, which they were coming to the end. There were very few adjustments that they were going to make to the end of the year. And so one of the reasons that those last dotted lines are suspect is that they're reflecting cities at a different period in their budget cycle. Nevertheless, it looks not so great. On the revenue side, I think this is probably a more telling graphic because, as we know, most all municipalities have access to a property tax. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 55%, and there are 19,000 plus municipalities, by the way. About 55% of those municipalities are also authorized to levy a sales tax, including Illinois municipalities. And only a few, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 11% of municipalities are authorized to levy an income or a wage tax. And most of those are concentrated in the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Kentucky, with a few cities such as Detroit, New York City, St. Louis, Kansas City, Missouri, and that have access to a wage tax. But for the most part, the decline that you see in the green dotted line demonstrates that those municipalities are seeing a sudden by March or so, are seeing a sudden decline in income tax or wage tax collections. Sales taxes, of course, as we are witnesses here in Chicago, sales taxes pretty much dried up quickly as people went into their homes and businesses were shuttered. The property tax, because of assessment practices, and it usually takes anywhere from 12 to 24 months, sometimes longer, for the real estate, the assessment to catch up with the actual value of homes. Property tax revenues are projected for this year, for fiscal year 2020, to be above what they were in 2019. Of course, we're expecting that will change in 2021 and 2022 if the real estate market doesn't come back as strong as they're projecting. As Paula indicated, there are reserves or ending balances of states and local governments that indicate, because they're required to have balanced budgets, indicate how much was left over at the end of the fiscal year. In this graphic, you can see it's the blue line is the actual ending balances as a percentage of expenditures. It's just a measure to identify how much cities are putting in savings. Now, what this does is it includes both allocated and unallocated reserves or ending balances, meaning that I don't separate the unallocated from the allocated. This is combined. The reason that that's important is that most municipalities actually have a policy to set aside some of their reserves at the end of the year for a particular thing, for a capital project, for example, or for programmatic activity, or for something else. So you can see that over the year, or at least since we've been collecting this data since 1985, that ending balances as a percentage of expenditures reached an all-time high in 2019, at least for this 35-year period, of almost 32%. Now that was audited fiscal year 2019 data. We did not estimate what the 2020 ending balances will be. But clearly this is a place where municipalities can reach into in times of emergency such as now. And they do have the reserves, but the reserves clearly aren't going to be enough to cover the costs of maintaining public service levels at the 2019 or 18 levels. Again, because there is no such thing as a model municipality. They're all different, and they rely on property and income and sales taxes, as well as tourist and lodging, restaurant, and other sorts of taxes and fees, in a different way. They're all somewhat different. But if you segregate the cities into these categories of those that only have the property tax as part of their general fund finances, the revenue estimation which we requested from the CFOs of the cities, how much do you think you're going to be losing in property tax receipts in the next year in fiscal between 20 and 21? You can see that the range goes from anywhere from a minor drop of about 0.3% to 10%. For the cities that have reliance on the property and income tax, the losses are also a little bit heavier, 0.7 to 10.3. But those with property and sales tax combinations, the range goes up to 14%. That's their projection and how much they may lose in FY21 compared to FY20. And those that have access to all three of them, property, sales, and income, the impact can be anywhere from 5.5 to 13.3% less. One of the reasons for than the last two, the sales, is there are a few cities that only levy a sales tax for operating purposes and that appear in the general fund. Those are almost all in the state of Oklahoma, where the sales tax is the dominant revenue source, and the property tax is primarily for debt retirement and not for the operations of the city. And you can see that those cities are also projecting anywhere from 0.8 to 12.4% loss in revenue. the reason that there is such variation in part is because of the elasticity or the reaction that revenue sources have to changes in the economy, which of course have to do with whether they are collected immediately, that is the tax, sales and income taxes, or whether they tend to be collected on an earlier value. Another reason that we are seeing, and I excuse the complexity of all of these names. I'm not quite the graphics expert here. But what I tried to plot here, and this was a project that I did with a colleague, and the Brookings Institution published it in March and April, is to say that which cities are more reliant on these very elastic taxes, the sales and income tax, in which the collection or the lack of collection will begin immediately when a person loses a job, the income or wage tax, or the people stop consuming because they're either businesses are closed down or because they're no longer feel confident that they should be purchasing things right now. The cities in that yellow boxed area are the cities that have a high reliance on those elastic revenue sources, the income or sales tax, more than 35% of their general fund revenue from these elastic sources. The green box over on the left side, close to the zero y-axis, are cities that are most reliant on the property tax or very little reliant on sales and income tax. The purpose of showing this graphic is to demonstrate that those, and the left axis, I'm sorry, the x-axis, I've got those mismarked, and my apologies. The metro employment was the purpose of showing the y-axis, it's mismarked as share of general fund revenues. It's really the share of metro employment in high-risk industries. Some industries, according to work that was done by Moody's Analytics and also by Brookings, indicated that there are some employment sectors that are going to be affected more than others immediately with the shutdown of the economy in March and April in particular, and those are the ones that are above about the 16% mark, are the ones that are highly reliant on these employment structures that are going to be affected immediately. So you can see that, for example, the Oklahoma City, the Fayetteville, Grand Rapids, Cincinnati, those are cities that have a high reliance on an elastic revenue source, the sales or income tax, but also have more than average employment in these high-risk industries. So they are going to be affected immediately and more severely than those that are in the quadrant on the lower left side, the cities that are reliant on a property tax but don't have a lot of employment, or at least less than average employment in these high-risk industries. So you can see over here Durham and Rochester. Chicago, because we only used the measure of sales and income tax as the elastic revenue source and not tourism and lodging and other sorts of taxes associated with tourism, is right around in this area. It just got cluttered with a lot of, I'm sorry, right up here, it got cluttered with a lot of other cities such as Chicago, Los Angeles. Nevertheless, if we factored in, which we didn't, but if we factored in some of these other more volatile revenues, such as tourism taxes, Chicago certainly would move over closer to that yellow area. This is just to sort of place the variation of revenue reliance across the country and where they're located, and you can see that a lot of states, the majority of states, actually allow their municipalities access to the property and the sales tax. Only one state has access to the sales tax, and just a few cities and just a few states allow cities access to all three general tax sources. Interesting graphic, and the point of that is to show that that it's really up to the states. States determine the revenue structure of municipalities, and there are models out there that the state of Illinois might want to consider. This is a graphic that I think demonstrates that the return to normal if there ever is such a thing, the return to normal may take longer than we certainly would hope. We plotted the return and these are in constant dollar terms, the general fund return to the dollar amount at the time of the beginning of the recession. So the green line is the bluish line is the first one that we have data on, the 1990 recession. You can see that it took a little more than 4 years after the 90 recession for the general fund revenues to rebound to what they were in 1990. The 2001 recession, the dot-com bust as we refer to it, it took a little bit longer, up to maybe 6 years, for general funds revenues to return to what they were at the beginning of the dot-com bust. And then the Great Recession, you can see that one, it sank to 2012. In the 6th year after the recession it began, it was continuing to decline, and there was still year-over-year losses, or at least the growth rate wasn't strong enough to rebound until just that number 12 out there is 2019. So it was in 2019 roughly that cities returned their general fund revenue in constant dollar terms back to what they were at the start of the recession. And then you can see that right now we're projecting that the 2020 recession, if it results in nearly 13% decline in general fund revenues in the last quarter or two, the expectation that it's going to be a V-shaped recovery, I think, is fairly remote. And I think this is the last graphic that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, and that is just to show that some cities have more authority than others. They're not as hemmed in, or what I call their fiscal policy space is not so constrained because of the influence of tax and expenditure limitations or appropriation limitations or other sorts of things that constrain the behavior of municipal governments. So in normal times, I think we tend to think of the options that confront municipalities and states, for that matter, as we can reduce spending and services, or we can raise taxes and fees to maintain service levels, or we certainly draw down reserves to protect service levels, which of course all municipalities and states are already doing. And as Paula noted, that the state of Illinois is not in a position to draw down something that it doesn't have. But that's the standard behavior of states and localities in what might be considered normal times. But I would argue that these aren't normal times, and this gives us this opportunity for thinking about non-incremental policy changes. I think we tend to, when we are confronted with crises or issues or concerns, as we start looking around the edges of what we can adjust a little bit in this direction, a little bit in that direction. But I would argue that now we need to think more boldly, bigger. One is to align the economic base of the city government or any local government with its fiscal architecture. It's an alignment question, and it's an alignment question between the growth engines of the economy, the underlying economic base, and the levers, the fiscal levers that the city has or the state has access to. Property tax, I think, we need to rethink. The property tax is a great way of assessing the income or the wealth of an individual 150 years ago. That's not a very good indicator today. Maybe we got to consider something else, such as a land tax, just as an idea. This is something that it just boggles the imagination that we have, rather than including services in our sales tax base, we continue to exclude most services. In the early to mid 1950s, the dollar that we spent for consumer goods, we had nearly 60 to 65% of that expenditure on goods that were taxable. In the intervening years, in the last 60 years, that it has flipped so that we only spend about 30 to 35% of the consumer dollar on taxable, that the other is on non-taxable services. We need to consider that. This is the time, I think, for local governments to propose a grand bargain with the states. As the previous graphics indicated, a lot of states really have a hammerhold on municipalities and do not give them the authority to respond to the interests and needs of their of the electorate, and to design programs and policies and tax structures that would fit the needs and interests of the local government. California just passed a law last October allowing cities and counties to create public banks as a way of providing resources to anyone within the county or the city, as a way of ensuring that money isn't leaving a particular area, and that it actually can support local businesses that used to be called mom and pop businesses. And finally, to sort of underscore a point that Paula made, is that the state is a counter-cyclical force. There's no reason that the state cannot be involved in providing the kind of support for local governments that's necessary, even under a balanced budget requirement, such as the state of Illinois, but there's no reason that states cannot borrow for investment purposes and infrastructure in a way to enhance and support, be a counter-cyclical force and enhance and support local governments. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation with my colleagues after this is over.
Thank you, Mike. Chris, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, I'm pulling it up right now. All right, good morning, everybody. First, I really want to thank Paula and Mike for really helping us understand and if you look at it, pretty scary, the challenges that state and local governments are facing. The Chicagoland's fortunate to have the skills and experience of Paula and Mike there, who are nationally known for the work that they do. And it's so critical in these times, I think, for practitioners to understand the data. And so thank you for the data and the policies that you recommend. What I'm going to do now that the stage has been set for what the challenges are is focus in on some work that we've been doing. We started this research during the global financial crisis, and we've now adapted it to, I would say, the more challenging times we're facing right now with COVID-19, the recession, civil unrest. And so I'm going to bring you through some materials, some resources that we've developed around and we were calling it fiscal first aid. First, there's 3 stages of recovery and there's 12 steps to recovery. The first.
Chris, I'm sorry, we can't actually view your screen.
Oh, shoot.
Perfect.
Got it now? Sorry about that.
No
Okay,
problem.
thank you. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so there's 3 stages to recovery and a 12-step program that we have. First is bridging. You're probably most of the way through bridging, or at least you should be. And it's really about the crisis happens. Who would have thought in February that we'd be where we are right now in August? So the crisis happens. We have the shutdown in the economy, the increased expenditures to serve your communities during COVID. And so you get through that initial piece of the bridging, and I'll give some examples of that, some tools that we have. Once you've bridged through the next, then it's an opportunity to reform. So you can do some short-term recovery, but it should, in the back of your mind, also think about what are some of the long-term things that you can do. Some of it at the national and the state level may be some of the policy changes like Paula and Mike talked about, but then also what can you do locally in local government? And then the third is to use this opportunity to transform. I think we've seen through some of both Paula and Mike's data that during the global financial crisis, part of the response was to think more long-term, so that state and locals, well, except for Illinois, built their reserves so that they were more prepared for the next crisis, which is hitting us now. So bridge, reform, and then transform. So let's look at some ways we can bridge. First of all, you have to recognize that you have a problem. I don't think there's any doubt in our minds right now that we're all faced with some real challenges. And around that, this idea of scenario planning. We've worked with some governments that have done as many as 7 different scenarios on the length of the crisis, how deeply they're hit based on their revenues, based on their risks, and then triggers along the way of when they'll take certain actions. So think about that approach. It's a good planning tool with your staff, your boards, and your community. Get help. I think, tap into resources where you can, whether it's working regionally with your partners, with nonprofits in the area, or tapping into higher education where they can assist. I know I was city manager of Roanoke during the global financial crisis. Virginia Tech, the land-grant university, was an extreme, a great resource that we tapped into a lot. You have to diagnose. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Really understand what the issues are based on your specific revenue expenditures. Stabilize. So there's some quick things that you may do in the short term, and it's really just to put that Band-Aid on, stop the bleeding, so that you can look for that long-term recovery. And then last, make sure you do no harm. What are some things that you really should not do? Now is not the time to do a pension contribution holiday or some other things that we would say are challenging for you. Okay, so we've gone from bridge to reforming. With reforming, you can start looking at, you've taken some short-term measures. What can you start doing in the longer term? This idea of lifestyle changes, this is an opportunity for you to relook at the way you've done things in the past. And times of scarcity often make us be a little bit more creative. And so what are some things that you might do differently? And this idea of never let a good crisis go to risk or go to waste. What are some things that you may be able to do now that you couldn't in the past? I'll give you one example. In Roanoke in 2017, where we were in our third year of declining revenues and looking at several more years, we had to reduce our capital program by about 25%. And they were, like many cities, looking for those big projects, a big commercial amphitheater, a big library with a Starbucks, and kind of those more suburban libraries that you see. Gave us an opportunity to relook at both of those, and I'll just talk about the libraries. So there's $15 million in there for a large super branch library, which was on the outskirts of the city. Well, Roanoke has a pretty high poverty rate. The neighborhood libraries had become an important community resource, especially as we were working on increasing the school outcomes. And so instead of the $15 million super branch, we spread those dollars out over 5 years and increased the size and the resources and technology in 5 neighborhood libraries, which I would say probably a better outcome in the long term. And and it impacted lots of other things helped, but we saw our on-time graduation rate from high school go from 58% to last year was 90% in a city with 24% poverty. So this is an opportunity. The message is this is an opportunity for you to look at some of those things that maybe you wouldn't have before. And then last is this an opportunity for you to transform, to really look at new ways that you do your work. Can you get new policies in place to help you build your reserves going forward? Because this is so, people are experiencing right now not having enough reserves. Is this the time to look at a comprehensive capital maintenance program? Stop the new projects and maintain what you have better. And might you relook at how you address public safety? And then we're really hoping that this is an opportunity to use an equity lens in your resource allocations going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about that some more later. And so here are the 12 steps. You can see the major stages of bridging, reforming, and transforming. So you start first with recognizing, I don't think any of us have any doubt right now that we are in a crisis. Mobilizing, and I think both your staff and your elected officials, but also your community. This is the time when you need to really communicate with them. Do those, generic treatments. Maybe you freeze your vacancies. Some of those things to give you some breathing room. You make your initial diagnosis. Hopefully, you've worked some scenarios around there, and then you apply your fiscal first aid. What are some things you can do right now so that you can start working toward that long-term recovery? Then you get into your detailed diagnosis, data-driven, and really drill down into what's your revenue mix, how have they been impacted in the past, what are your financial challenges, what are the issues that you need to face right away. Put together your recovery plan, and then start putting in place your long-term therapies, which may be capital asset management, or approaching your budgeting through equity. your long-term financial planning, so you can really look at how do you build a thriving community, not just come out of this and try to recreate what you were. Through all of this, a key piece is this idea of recovery leadership. You know, you have to build trust in your community if you're going to make some bold moves. You have to be more transparent than ever, provide information as often as you can to your community. And then it would have been good if you did this before, but you have to have that discussion about values. What are the values that are critical to you? Because you want to use those values as you're making those tough but necessary decisions. And hopefully you've developed some financial policies that will be a guide through all this. So the hope is that by following through all of these, you will build a strong, thriving community, as opposed to this idea of bankruptcy or receivership, which we've seen happen. It's very doesn't happen a lot with state and local governments or with local governments, but it is a possibility, and so this is how we avoid that. Here's some tools that you can use under the bridging, and these are all free on our website, gfwa.org. We have some good research on how you diagnose your financial condition, managing cash flows, and we have a webinar around that too, with some examples of some good scenario planning that some governments have done. Two resources here, balancing the budget in bad times. One is your primary treatments, which are things like, you look at your personnel, it's probably a large part of your budget. What are some purchasing strategies you can do? For example, do you have maybe some software contracts where there's a high maintenance charge you can renegotiate? Ongoing expenditures, people working from home, can you relook at your supplies? Pooling resources and partnering. This is a time to look, can you provide services more effectively through use of nonprofits, partnering there or with other governments, looking at your capital equipment and debt, and then really understanding your revenue portfolio. I think in Paula's and Mike's work, you see how critical that revenue piece is. And then the part two of this is the riskier treatments. We would say avoid these large across the board cuts. They're uneven. They may be easy or politically, but they don't have good consequences or outcomes. We recommend you avoid early retirement incentives. Tax anticipation notes may be necessary, but try to avoid them. Hopefully you have the reserves for cash flow. Don't underfund accrued liabilities, your OPEB or pension. We strongly recommend against pension obligation bonds, especially now when the market's so high. And then whatever you do, don't default on debt, because it doesn't just impact you, it hurts the whole local, state and local government market. Next piece in bridging is we have some research on how to do short-term strategies to really look at your cash flow issues. And then special look at fiscal first aid in the procurement office. There's a lot that happens in procurement that can help you be more efficient, both improve your services and maybe reduce some costs. So we did a special look at that. And then we move into the reform piece. And so under the reform, these long-term treatments, I want to stress again, an underlying piece of that is trust. You can't really make systemic changes unless you have the trust of your community members, of your council. And so some things you could look at under long-term strategies is how can you tap into technology improvements that could help you. We're really looking at decision science and how that can help state and local governments make better decisions in the long run and get community support for it. There's tools that are being used in new ways like GIS in terms of your land use planning and revenue planning. But the key through all of this, we believe, is that strong community engagement if you're going to have support for the difficult decisions that you have to make. Let me move to the last, and also under reform, just a couple resources I wanted to point out. One is we've just released a research paper on imposed fees, fines, and asset forfeitures. And then also I want to recommend Paula's work on performing fine and fee policies in the criminal justice system. Now, what we found in many communities that have become dependent on imposed fees, traffic citations, parking tickets that often escalate, where people can actually end up in jail if they don't pay them. And it has all kinds of impacts, and it definitely has a disparate impact on lower income communities and communities with people of color. And so there's an opportunity to maybe look at reforming some of those as you're looking at your total revenue system. So I highly recommend you look at this. And we do have a dashboard on our website that has every state and locality with population over 10,000. You can actually click into it and see what percentage of your revenue comes from imposed fees and fines. And if it's too high, probably something that you should look at. And then the last piece is this idea of transforming. We do have some research on bankruptcy. I hope that's nothing that you have to use, but that is available. And then the transform part, we've done some research based on common pool resource theory, which is really about how you share a common resource like farmers sharing grazing land, or fishermen, folks fishing, sharing a fishery to not overuse it. And so we approach the municipal budget that way, that it's a scarce resource, and there's ways that you can, we'd call it pillars that you can set up, really about leadership, so that you can make those long-term decisions for resiliency. And so we have a book out on this and several webinars and other resources about how to build these pillars in your community so you can make those tough decisions with community support to really transform the way you do your services. A key piece underlying all of this, again, is trust, and how you build trust in the community. And with that, again, I want to remind you, all these resources are available free on our website. Our mission is to serve our members, but also to serve communities around the U.S. and the public finance field, where we can, partnering with great researchers like Paul and Mike and others. And want to let you know one other really timely resource. On Thursday, we have a webinar on implementing the CARES Act. So whether you're an initial recipient or a sub-recipient, we're going to bring in speakers, nationally recognized speakers around this area. We've been in touch with all of our members about how they've approached it. And so from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time, we'll have that. And I encourage you, if you've received any CARES Act funding, to take advantage of this so that you can make sure that you follow all the rules that you need to. And with that, I'll toss it back over to you, Adam. I'll stop my share.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Paula and Mike, if you could unmute and enable your webcams as well, we can get started on a conversation. Wow, that was a lot. That was great. I feel full, like I had a good meal. And just as a reminder for all of our participants, can you, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the Q&A box on our web portal. The first question that I would like to ask you all is, Illinois in particular has been trying to decrease expenditures and increase revenue over several years as we're trying to address our own financial condition. But the pandemic does kind of put that a bit on its head. How can state and local governments redirect funds to address economic downturn and changes in service needs while also addressing some of our financial challenges locally and at the state level? And whoever wants to take that question first, I'll offer it up.
Well, I'll get out of the box here by actually challenging the premise that the state of Illinois has taken meaningful steps to sort of get its budget gap closed. It is true that we have flirted with some changes in our individual income and corporate income tax rate structure, and we are poised to vote on a ballot proposal this November about changing it even further to allow for a progressive rate structure. But I think Mike Pagano laid it out pretty nicely that basically states and municipal governments are operating with legacy fiscal systems that do not well align with our contemporary economy. State of Illinois has, I think, the last time I looked, of 150 odd different services that could be in the sales tax space, it taxed 7 of them. Well below the median state, and certainly even further below the better performing states. So, on the sales tax, for example, we're not there. We've never made a meaningful effort, and this addresses one issue that came up in the Q&A I saw. We've never been able to make the case in Illinois in particular, but more generally, that certain kinds of services and government should be funded explicitly by user fees. And I think that has done us a disservice to not think about why in certain situations relying on user fees can make a lot of sense from an equity and yes, an efficiency and yes, an equity perspective. So I feel like certainly locally, we still have a lot of things we could do. And I guess I'll just pass it off to Chris and Mike to pick this up. Historically, what states do primarily is cut their budgets. They don't so much raise taxes during recessions. But that cutting of services does end up hampering any recovery that we're going to have from whatever that cyclical downturn is. And that's where we really want to sort of be focused here, because, we're looking at a world where the estimates of the layoffs we've experienced, that over 20% of them are going to be permanent. That's a huge negative shock to us in the economy. So I think we really want to avoid repeating what we've done in the past. And I think Mike and Chris have laid out some great ideas for us to consider to move forward.
There are a couple of, just to follow up on Paula's points, I'm not certain what the spending reductions, what the analysis of the spending reductions and the approach to spending reductions at the state level have been. What was behind the reductions, if there were any, and but we have a lot of legacy costs from previous administrations that were, the old saying of kicking the can down the road. We can't kick it down much further. The typical response to a recession or some kind of an external shock to the economy on the part of local governments and states as well is to first to draw down. I mean, the purpose of having reserves or rainy day funds is to address the rainy days, and this is a rainy day. But the state doesn't have a rainy day fund to speak of anymore. Many states do. In fact, they were, prior to this year, in fiscal year 2019, the estimates were that for the median state, they had nearly, the rainy day funds had nearly 8% of expenditures in them. And if you took all of the reserves, and including other budget stabilization funds in states, it was closer to 14% of expenditures. So that's going to be the first place where states will go. Illinois is the exception here. The second activity that cities and states tend to do is they remember, basic operations of state and local governments are very labor intensive. So we have police and transportation and safety, and we have our courts and prisons, and we have education, which are all very highly labor intensive. And when there is a reduction in revenue, and you want to at least not reduce the services too much, you take it from a place where the impact is a little bit further down the line, and that's from the capital side. So there's often a transition of revenue resources from the capital budget into the operating budget, not bond revenue when you've issued debt that can only be used for a capital facility, but the cash resources that support capital projects. And the third area, and when we saw this right away, is that the announcement of we're not going to fill any of our vacancies, our employment position. Those are three very easy, simple, and typical kinds of responses. The state of Illinois does not have the luxury in any of those three areas, and needs to reconsider what it does and how it does what it's doing. And that's why I'm optimistic that there are enough willing people within the state who have some great ideas about how to make it a better resource, or I refer to it as sort of the, in using civil engineers term, of an architecture. The fiscal architecture of the state has to be sound, and the fiscal architecture of the state has to be equitable and just. So how much, as Paula was just saying, how much we rely solely on user fees for particular activities without an understanding that user fees, because it's based on the principle that if I want to consume that service and I have the capacity to, I will. But if you don't have the capacity to, but it's a necessary service, water is a good one, then how do we design a system that recognizes ability to pay and the benefits principle and gets us out of the sort of, we continue to raise taxes without thinking about what taxes we want to raise and for what purpose. And do we need to protect all the services, or is this the time that we have the conversation about what are the core essential services of state and local governments in Illinois and in the city and around the country? But is this the time to have that conversation? I would think so.
Yeah, a quick point to build on both of them. You know, we're not seeing, while other states and localities have built their reserves after the global financial crisis, we haven't seen any real systemic reform in a 19th century revenue system. So the question is Illinois in such a crisis that it might be the state that will step forward and do a real meaningful look at what Mike calls the architecture. I guess the other piece is my mantra. Helping a city get through the global financial crisis was you can't merely cut your way to prosperity. You have to cut and you have to invest. And so, you know, what are those core things that the state of Illinois and localities can invest in now, and it may be moving funds from somewhere else, that can invest in now that's going to lead to long-term sustainability and build a real thriving state and locality. Because now, especially we found with work from home, people can work from anywhere. You want them to choose Illinois, not Florida. How are you going to make that happen?
Yes, thanks for those responses. One follow-up. We've been talking a lot about the financial condition of the state and local governments, but we also need to support our governments in responding to COVID-19. And as we try to look at the health and economic impacts, there's also the social impacts that we're feeling right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, and most recently the tragedy up in Kenosha, Wisconsin. How can we use this moment to address social inequities and asymmetries communities are experiencing, and how can government finance play a role in addressing some of that impact?
Well, you know, I think if we take the question in a little different manner, and that is, has the public finance system that we currently reside under here in Illinois and in the city of Chicago and in suburban Cook and elsewhere in the metro area and around the country, have we designed a financial structure that is fair and equitable? And what we've discovered, what we know is that, and what we just learned, what was it, just the last year, 2 years ago, the way the property tax assessment in Cook County was, is that it was highly regressive. In other words, we were putting burdens on low-income people for decades. We had a very unfair system, and is it the time to address that system? Absolutely. This is the time to rethink what Chris called a 19th century model, to rethink a 19th century model in the 21st century, and keep in mind the need for equity and social justice in the building of that structure.
Yeah, you know, I think so. If you look at what we've seen, the disparate impact of COVID-19, of the recession, of civil unrest, and I would throw in climate change too, for many localities. So is this finally that inflection point where we're going to get serious about this? And so I can tell you with GFOA, we're undertaking a major research project with budgeting and seeing if we can actually work into budgeting, you know, decision sciences, real use of data, real citizen engagement of all community members, and making resource allocations through an equity lens. So, you know, might that be the one positive impact that comes out of this, is that we really get serious about these issues we've known have been there for decades, if not longer.
Just a couple of quick responses from me. I think we've turned to our our public safety professionals and employees and sector to provide an extraordinarily wide range of services. And this is an opportunity now, for all the reasons already alluded to rethink that and to think in terms of narrow provision of public safety versus investment in communities, investment in disadvantaged individuals and communities and jurisdictions. And, you know, police officers are first responders to many situations where at some level they're being asked to address non-public safety problems, and they don't necessarily have the training, the tools, or resources to be the best responders there. So let's reallocate, let's think about that reallocation process seriously. And, you know, just want to give a bit of a shout out to Cook County for how it approached the allocation of CARES funding to its suburban municipalities. You know, standard easy way to proceed is typically per capita types of funding choices. And the leadership at Cook County decided they wanted to think about some other aspects of that. And I'm not weighing in on what particular set of allocations they ended up making, but I do think it's that kind of effort and linking allocation choices to needs and capacities, very important sort of in the current environment.
Yeah, that's really good. A lot of considerations, and I'm happy to hear that we're rethinking budgeting at this time as well to be more responsive to the needs of community and disinvested community groups in particular. My next question is, was forecasted by Dr. Pagano's presentation about changing up the mix of tax revenues. And someone did ask, should we depend less on property and sales tax to a less volatile land tax? And you recommended that, Dr. Pagano, in your presentation. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Certainly. We have, since the founding of the Republic, state and local states were highly dependent on the property tax. That was really their major revenue source for a long time. The property tax at the time was a pretty good reflection of the wealth of an individual. Those that had more, and the reason was we didn't have this prolific stock market that we have now. So the people didn't have their wealth there. They had their wealth in their property, whether it was factories or their homes or their farms. That has changed over time. The agricultural economy, we became an urban nation in 1920. So we moved away from an agricultural base a long time ago. And there have been calls for reforming, not eliminating the property tax, but reforming the way it is implemented and the way it's constructed. And I threw out, just because we have been talking about it for almost more than 100 years now, a land tax. In other words, tax land at a very, very high rate, which would encourage the optimal use of that land for wherever it's located in the city or the state. But don't tax, or tax at a very low level, the structures on that land. So rather than holding something that has a lot of value, that could encourage more housing, and God knows we have a shortage of housing, that would encourage more housing and not encourage hoarding land for some future use 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, but put it to its best and highest use today. So there are some illustrations of where the land tax in this country that is used. Pennsylvania is one of those. Mm-hmm. The city of Pittsburgh was the largest to use it at one time, and it abolished it in 2000 for political reasons, not for any good economic reasons. But it might be something to consider. Would I recommend it? I don't know. I might recommend that we think about it, but there has to be a fairer way of creating a property tax that doesn't put. So by having the property tax system we have now, we reward somebody who has vacant land in a very desirable place. Well, that shifts the cost of services to other owners of lesser land, because they're paying a higher property tax rate to generate the same amount of money. because of the lack of incentive to improve property. So it's an idea. It's one that the George Land Economics talks about quite a bit. A lot of interesting studies and work. Something to just we need to consider. Why not?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Pagano. Dr. Worthington, I know you and I have talked several times about infrastructure investment and its impact on the region. And we did mention that often states divert cash to services in times of crisis and neglect our infrastructure. What can you tell our state leaders about the need for infrastructure investment for the future and for an equitable recovery?
Sure. Well, thank you, Adam. I guess I would put a big frame about it and just point out that, you know, we invest in infrastructure to increase productivity. And it's a question about what's that link between public sector capital and productivity growth. It's pretty robust, but there's differences of opinion of how big the impact really is. But that's kind of why we do it. We have roads, highways, bridges, transit, water infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure. You know, in the water and transportation space, that's what we mostly think about because that's where governmental ownership and control is most common. And states and local governments are basically on the front line. They're the ones who are funding it. They are the ones who own it. And, you know, evidence suggests that the returns to certain kinds of local infrastructure investments are significant, and it can add to GDP growth, right? It can add in sort of the fiscal multiplier sense. And, you know, 2 years ago, I probably would have said, oh, well, yeah, sure, it's going to add to GDP growth, but, you know, with labor markets so tight, there's only so much room for that effect to go. Now, of course, we're in a very different situation. So infrastructure investment may have more beneficial fiscal multiplier effects than we previously had thought. Now, with all that said, you know, states, as we've heard from Chris and Mike, you know, what these local governments and states typically are going to try to do is protect their core service provision, since service provision by states and local governments is people-centric. We need people to do it. We need employees and workers to do it. That means preserving their jobs so they can provide the services that we all want and desire and need. It means shorting your maintenance budgets. It means cutting back on your ambitious new projects. What I would say is Chris's story about Roanoke, very instructive, okay? Pull it back, reallocate it, but don't give up completely. And on the maintenance front, do not give up on the maintenance front. We've already heard the city of Chicago budget officers talking in the last couple months about shortfalls in the regular maintenance budget. They want to fix more potholes and fix more streets, the arterial streets, the local streets, but they don't have the funds for it. And that's going to make it even harder to live here and less desirable if indeed you can work from home anywhere. And the last thing I would say, federal support, kind of important. ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, included a significant boost for highway spending, which went out to states based on some per capita measures, lane miles, various kinds of things, and usage measures. And the evidence suggests that that funding was effective in boosting state spending on highways above what it would have been in the absence of that federal stimulus money. Yes, state spending declined during the Great Recession, but it would have declined even further had the states not received this boost. So there is a role for federal support here as well.
And I would want to say we do advocacy work in DC for state and local government. there is, we are somewhat hopeful that finally we're going to get around to a national approach to infrastructure. We've been talking about it for years. There is bipartisan support for it. And so it does look like there will be something coming out, we hope, over this fall sometime. And absolutely, I agree with Paul, absolutely necessary right now. And include broadband in that too, so we can deal with the equity issues with that.
That's great. I have one final question, although we had several really good ones come through our Q&A box. What gives you hope during this time? I know in Illinois, when we talk about taxes and finance and revenues and expenditures, it's all doom and gloom. What gives you hope for the future? What opportunities do you see bubbling up nationally, locally, in your experience and in your conversations with others for the future of our region?
Well, I'll go first if you don't mind. I would say I am optimistic on a number of fronts. One is that we have never experienced such a catastrophic decline in not just the economy, but in our fiscal resources to provide services to state and local governments. We have never experienced what a pandemic can do to the provision of a basic service, public schools, K through 12 education, let alone higher education, but K through 12 education in particular. That we have been, the people have been resilient. They've been thinking of new ways of doing things. Businesses are, I mean, it's going to affect the commercial real estate market for sure, for certain, but we have new ways, we will have new ways coming out of this of organizing what we do, the behavior of the firm kind of changes. We also have on the spending side the activism that has manifested itself with demonstrations, especially after the George Floyd murder, in which there are calls for reform. It's not, and I would say that the calls for reform should not just be about police, but it should be about reforming local government's service delivery and what we've been talking about, reforming the way in which we build a resource or a fiscal architecture to provide for those services. This is a crisis moment. We are, I would say that we're in this lull right now, in that Congress did not pass the HEROES Act, which would have provided around $850 billion to state and local governments. And it's unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon, which means that cities and states are now wrestling immediately with a severe crisis. This isn't something that we can just postpone by doing those typical things that we tend to. We have to reconsider and restructure what we're doing, not just spending, service delivery, but also on the revenue and the resource side. So, you know, we're a very smart group to respond to crisis situations. We're not very good at anticipating, kicking the can down the road. The can is here. We have to deal with it now. And I think there are enough in Illinois and in Chicago who are ready to take on massive changes in how we do business at public service business and how we create tax and fee structures for our cities and states.
All right. I'd say real quickly, the assets that the Chicago metro area has are just incredible in terms of higher education, in terms of the business community, in terms of location, the airport. So while you're coming from behind, losing the race among other states, the assets you have, if people can recognize what they are and then partner and work together. I mean, I'm very hopeful for the area. You know, our offices are based down in the Loop, and I love Chicago, and so it's got to succeed. And I feel really strongly that it will because of those assets, including the MPC.
What Mike and Chris said.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, Mike, and Chris, for your thoughts and your vision for our present and our future. It was great speaking with you and hearing your wisdom. As a reminder for everyone, this recording will be available on our website, and watch our MPC Twitter and Instagram accounts, as well as the GFOA group that will post this video as well. Thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.